in the dead of night, with visibility nearly zero and only the runway lights as their faint guide. Ares Flight 8250 made its final approach towards San Andres Island. After a 4-hour delay and a turbulent journey through storms, the weary crew looked forward to landing and ending a long, exhausting day. Yet, hidden in the darkness lay an invisible threat. Believing they were safely above their intended path, the pilots unknowingly descended too low, falling victim to the black hole illusion. A dangerous optical deception where total darkness tricks pilots into thinking they are higher than they truly are. Combined with heavy weather and fatigue, the situation quietly evolved into a deadly trap. In the early hours of August 16, 2000, T-722, registered as HK4682, was preparing for a scheduled domestic flight from Bogotá to San Andres Island, Colombia. The flight, originally set to leave on the night of August 15 at 9:29 p.m., faced multiple delays. The estimated departure time was first revised to 10:50 p.m., then pushed again to 11:45 p.m. The hours ticked by as passengers waited at the gate. Finally, after the long delay, 105 passengers, a mix of tourists and locals from Colombia, the United States, France, Brazil, Costa Rica, and Germany, boarded the aircraft. The crew consisted of 4 flight attendants and 2 pilots. The captain, Wilson Gutierrez, was an experienced pilot with more than 7,600 flight hours, primarily on turboprop aircraft. Having recently transitioned to the Boeing 707, he was serving as pilot flying on this leg. His co-pilot, First Officer Camilo Galvan, had accumulated about 1,900 hours of total flight experience and was serving as the pilot monitoring. Both men were well rested, but ready for a challenging night flight. At 11:25 p.m., the flight crew contacted Bogotá Ground Control to confirm their new departure time and received clearance to taxi to runway 31 right. With engines started and pre-flight checks completed, they began their taxi. After several minutes of waiting for other traffic to clear, the tower gave the go-ahead. At 12:07 a.m., more than 3 hours behind schedule, Flight 8250 roared down runway 31 right and lifted off from El Dorado International Airport. The aircraft climbed smoothly, cutting through the darkness as it reached its cruising altitude. The early portion of the flight was uneventful. The cabin atmosphere was calm, passengers were settling in, some already asleep, others reading or quietly chatting as the jet made its way northward. The route from Bogotá to San Andres usually takes about an hour and 40 minutes, crossing over the Andes Mountains, the Colombian Plains, and finally out across the Caribbean Sea. The approach to San Andres, however, is known to be tricky, especially at night, as pilots must descend over dark ocean waters with minimal visual reference apart from the runway lights. At 1:00 a.m., roughly 45 minutes before landing, the captain began the approach briefing with the first officer. Together, they reviewed critical details, weather conditions, the expected route, runway in use, navigation aids, altitudes, and possible challenges. Captain Gutierrez programmed the Geiger 3 Alpha arrival and V Zulu approach for runway 06 into the aircraft's flight management system. San Andres Airport features a single runway, 2,380 meters long and 36 meters wide, surrounded by ocean on both sides. A nighttime approach is particularly hazardous because pilots can't distinguish between land and sea. The airport uses a VOR DME navigation system, where the VOR provides directional guidance and the DME indicates distance, helping pilots maintain their descent path precisely. After finishing the approach briefing, the crew noticed worsening weather conditions on radar. Heavy rain clouds and turbulence loomed ahead. Captain Gutierrez requested permission to deviate 8 to 10 miles to the right of the planned route to avoid the worst of the storm. For the next 20 minutes, the flight continued normally. The crew maintained steady communication with air traffic control as the aircraft descended toward the island. At 1:25 a.m., Flight 8250 contacted Panama Control, requesting clearance to begin descent. ATC initially approved a descent to 20,000 feet, then soon revised it to 24,000 feet to maintain separation with other traffic. Concerned about the weather, the captain asked for an updated report. San Andres Tower replied that runway 06 was in use, winds were calm, visibility was 10 kilometers, with broken clouds at 1,500 feet, a temperature of 30°C, and stormy weather nearby but without rain at the field. At 48 miles from San Andres, Panama Control cleared the aircraft to descend further and handed them over to San Andres Control. But as they continued their descent, the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. The radar lit up with patches of red, heavy precipitation and turbulence. Inside the cabin, the aircraft began to shake lightly, causing concern among the passengers. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, reassuring everyone that the turbulence was temporary. The pilots requested direct routing to the Geiger waypoint and were cleared to descend to 3,000 feet for the V-Zulu approach to runway 06. This procedure required precise adherence to altitude and timing. The approach started at Geiger, 12 nautical miles from the VOR DME station at 3,000 feet, descending at a 5.2% gradient toward the final approach, fix FAF at 1,600 feet. By that point, the aircraft had to be fully configured for landing gear down, flaps extended, and airspeed stable. If the runway wasn't visible by the missed approach point 0.9 nautical miles from the VOR, they were supposed to climb away and go around. At 1:40 a.m., as they neared the island, the first officer lowered the landing gear and adjusted the flaps for the final landing configuration. The weather had worsened, rain intensified, visibility dropped to just 5 kilometers, and wind speeds increased. They received landing clearance from the tower for runway 06. The captain disengaged the autopilot and took manual control for the final descent. However, with visibility nearly gone and only the runway lights visible, the pilots fell into the black hole illusion. They believed they were higher than they were, and unknowingly flew below the correct glide slope. Heavy rain, low clouds, and the lack of ground lighting created a perfect storm for spatial disorientation. The captain, used to flying smaller turboprop planes, applied a landing technique that left little margin for error in a jet aircraft, aiming to touch down right at the start of the runway, a move that proved risky under such conditions. As the aircraft descended through 500 feet, the ground proximity warning system announced 500. Checked, all set for landing, the captain confirmed. The rain pounded against the windshield. The first officer switched the wipers to intermittent mode, struggling to see ahead. The warnings continued. The aircraft was too low, but the crew didn't respond. The ground proximity system issued critical alerts, sink rate, pull up, but the descent continued. The darkness had fully at 1:49 a.m., with visibility reduced to almost nothing. Aries Flight 8250 descended through the final few hundred feet. Heavy rain and turbulence buffeted the aircraft. Despite multiple ground proximity warning system alerts, the crew continued with the approach, convinced they were aligned correctly with runway 06. The illusion of being higher than they actually were proved fatal. Suddenly, just moments from the runway threshold, the aircraft struck the ground 49 meters short of the paved surface. The impact tore through the fuselage, causing the landing gear to collapse and one of the engines to shear off from the wing. The jet skidded violently across the tarmac for nearly 500 feet, scattering debris and sparks in every direction before breaking apart into 3 major sections. Inside the cabin, chaos erupted. Passengers were thrown from their seats. Overhead bins burst open, and screams filled the darkness. Despite the catastrophic impact, a miracle unfolded. The majority of those on board survived. One of the flight attendants quickly opened the forward cabin door, deploying the emergency slides and guiding passengers to safety amid fire and smoke. Emergency teams at San Andres Airport responded immediately, racing toward the wreckage. They extinguished flames and evacuated survivors with remarkable speed. In the end, 2 lives were lost and over 100 others were injured, some seriously. But given the magnitude of the crash, the survival rate was astonishing, a testament to the durability of the aircraft's design and the swift emergency response that followed. When investigators from the Colombian Civil Aviation Authority (UAEAC) arrived on site, they faced a haunting scene. The wreckage was scattered near the runway's approach lights, the tail section lying separated from the main fuselage. Black boxes were quickly recovered and sent for analysis. The investigation revealed several key contributing factors behind the tragedy. First, severe weather conditions were identified as a primary challenge. Thunderstorms and heavy rain drastically reduced visibility, making it nearly impossible for the pilots to rely on external visual cues. The black hole illusion, which occurs when pilots approach over dark terrain or water at night, played a decisive role in misleading the flight crew into believing they were at a safe height. Analysis of the flight data recorder (FDR) showed that the aircraft consistently flew 50 to 300 feet below the correct glide path, well beneath the recommended approach profile. Despite clear warnings from the ground proximity warning system, the pilots did not initiate a go-around. Another factor highlighted was Captain Gutierrez's transition from turboprop aircraft to jet operations. His approach technique, attempting to land precisely at the start of the runway, might have worked on smaller turboprops, but offered no margin for error in a 737, particularly under such poor conditions. This decision reduced the buffer zone available for a safe flare or go-around. The investigation report concluded that insufficient response to GPWS warnings was a major lapse. The alerts, terrain, pull up, were repeated multiple times during the final descent. Both pilots acknowledged them verbally but took no corrective action. Even as the first officer urged the climb, the captain maintained the approach, likely believing they were still within safe parameters. The inquiry also found that training deficiencies contributed to the accident. While both pilots had solid flight experience, additional simulator sessions focused on non-precision approaches and black hole illusions might have prepared them better for such a situation. It was recommended that future training emphasize adverse weather operations, strict adherence to approach minima, and better use of cockpit automation during difficult conditions. Following the report's publication, both Ares Airlines and the Colombian Civil Aviation Authority implemented several key safety measures. These included updated standard operating procedures for night and stormy approaches, expanded simulator training to include black hole illusion recovery and decision-making under spatial disorientation, mandatory crew resource management (CRM) refreshers, emphasizing assertive communication and timely decision-making in critical moments. As a result, Colombian aviation safety standards were significantly strengthened, ensuring that future crews would be better equipped to avoid similar tragedies.